Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Roger Bingham, and, well, you don't look very lonely. You look very good. This is wonderful. Let me just, this is the second of a series of gatherings that are followed by a student conversation that we've been doing under the auspices of the Institute for Neural Computation at UC San Diego. Terry Sinofsky here is director of the INC, and Terry and I worked for many years together on the Science Network and other things as well. But let me just, we did the first one we did was on conscience with Patricia Churchland and Reed Montague. And we made a little movie from it. Lara at the back, who's running that camera, made a movie. So it's only about a minute and a bit, and it'll just give you some sense of what we're talking about. It's about conscience, very briefly, but then I'll explain what we're going to do this evening as well. But let's just have a look at the movie. To start a conversation takes just one word. Something on your mind, something in the news, something that science explores. You need a place to ponder the possibilities of that word, the connection to other parts of your life, to history, philosophy, to the arts and humanities. A place to offer your opinions, but always a place where you can discover the facts of the matter, provided by expert guides. That place is the Collaboratory and the Science in Society series, a place to bridge the chasm between the creators and the consumers of science and technology. It begins with a public gathering, followed by student collaborators engaging the guides and imagining tomorrow's world. The first word is conscience. Your guides are Patricia Churchland and Reed Montague. To start a conversation takes just one word. Yes. Join us. Okay, thanks very much. That should give you some sort of a sense about what we're trying to do here, which is to have conversations. So this evening's conversation is about loneliness. There's a huge amount of material, as I discovered when I started going through it. We're very lucky to have three wonderful speakers here this evening. Why don't we start then by having the three speakers. They will talk briefly, and then we'll have a conversation with the speakers and also with all of you. And that's the whole point of all of this, is to get a conversation going. So, Candice, are you going to start? This is Candice Odgers. You've probably read some of these things before about her. You know, you write to me from Duke some of the time. She's at UC Irvine, allegedly.
And Duke.
Right?
Go Blue Devils. Yeah.
And what I'm particularly interested in is she was at the Carter meeting some time ago, and we had a nice conversation. And you can read about her on the back of here. But what's interesting, as she wrote in a recent comment in the journal Nature, studies so far do not support fears that digital devices are driving the downfall of a generation. And this, I've got a whole pile of literature here, some of which says that it is in fact responsible, some of which said it isn't. So it's very important, I think, to get some sort of clarity on this. So, Candice.
All right. Hi, I'm Candice. I spend most of my time studying mental health among young people, and I just wanted to start by saying that one of the things that we're observing is an uptick in loneliness, anxiety, depression. So we have a sample of people in Britain, young people in Britain, 18-year-olds, and we're seeing levels of reported loneliness that are similar to what we would see in much older adults. So during this transition to adulthood, we're seeing these high reports of loneliness. Mental health, we're seeing increases in depression and anxiety. And this is causing a lot of panic, and rightly so, in terms of what's driving these causes, what we can do to prevent loneliness, depression, things that are very costly to health and to well-being. And we hear a lot about the fears associated with this. We read about it every day. Roger's shared some of this. The fears are the smartphone. You know, young people today spend about 6 hours a day on their digital devices. They spend more time on their digital devices and digital spaces than they do in school. And the fear is that this is causing them to become addicted to their phone, depressed, lonely, right, losing skills. And you've all heard these things, and you've probably felt these fears yourself. And so what I wanted to do was start out with a set of kind of controversial slides. These slides always get me in trouble. So if you are angered by these slides, you are not the first audience to be so. And I'd be happy to kind of start the conversation off with a bit of controversy. So these are the fears that we have. These are the fears that we hear every day in the media. These are the fears that parents were bringing to us as we studied adolescents. About a decade ago, we started tracking young people on their mobile devices. We didn't care about mobile devices. We wanted a better measure of their mental health. And it turned out that mobile devices and digital devices quickly became part of the conversation around mental health. So here are the fears. But interesting, the facts, they tell a very different story. And the story to us was actually really surprising. We didn't believe the story the facts were telling us at first. And part of it was so incongruent with what we were hearing in terms of fears that parents had, in terms of what we were reading in the media, in terms of what we were people generally believed about the relationship between devices disconnecting kids from each other and causing mental health problems. So the facts, we recently published this month that kind of, again, made kind of a little bit of a splash. We ended up in the front page of the New York Times, and I got a lot of hate mail for this, which was interesting. You know, everything from a bad mom to working or Facebook, or at Facebook, or with Facebook, or something like that. But what we did is we said, okay, we need to take stock of this. This conversation has been going on. These are really serious concerns. We're talking about depression, we're talking about suicide, we're talking about anxiety among young people. We need to understand what are the real causes. And if smartphones and social media is to blame, we need to figure that out, right? We need to understand and work with tech companies around that. So we looked at the big pre-registered data, so hundreds of thousands of surveys that have been done with young people, and we curated that. We looked at all of the recent meta-analyses and reviews that have been done on this topic. So does more time are kids spending on screens, does that relate to mental health problems? And my kids were very interested in the answer to this question, right? The number one fight in our home and other phones is what? Screen time. And it's screen time, it's not what you're doing on your screens. That's the important part. We brought this all together, and then we summarized this daily diary data, this kind of stuff that we do where we kind of creepily track kids on their phones and figure out today, how much time were you online, you know, how's your mental health, how's your loneliness, etc. And what we found across all of these things was a very tiny association with no way to figure out whether it went one way or the other, whether screens were the cause of the effect of the loneliness and depression. And most of these associations went away, half were in one direction, half were in another. And the biggest thing is it was so incongruent with the fears that we're having. In our own research, when we track kids every day, and this is North Carolina, Duke, Roger, where we have our study. So 2,000 kids, we follow them every day on their phones. They respond to surveys 3 times a day. We track their mental health. And we find no daily linkages between kids spending more time online on a given day and their mental health problem, except we do find a pattern where on days where kids are more connected, social media, texting, etc., they feel less lonely. They feel more connected, right? So this is the pattern that we see, which is, again, contrary to the fear narrative. So what does it mean, all of the fears around this generation, right? This generation that we believe is lost to their phone. If you actually look at a lot of metrics, the kids today are okay, right? You know, as a parent, I'm starting to feel a bit better. We have the highest rates of completion of high school than we've had in history, right? Falling rates of teen pregnancy and birth, and these are over decades, right? So things really costly and expensive problems that we've been trying to fix for a long time, these have been falling. Kids today are safer, more educated, more connected than ever, and declining rates of substance use, teen birth, and violence, especially in the United States. And so the stats look pretty good. In fact, this generation looks better than us, right? They do. And in fact, we text more and drive than they do, if you look at the data. Okay, so focus groups, when you run with kids and you bring kids in, it turns out if you actually track kids on their phone, what they're doing, isn't that interesting? It's mostly the same stuff they've always been doing, kind of chatting to their friends offline, arranging hookups, meetups, that kind of thing. Now, it's not to say there's nothing bad that's associated with technology. That's not what I'm saying here. There's not to say that there's some kids who aren't vulnerable to the effects and the bullying that happen online. But the main story is that there's a lot of overlap between how kids are doing offline. Those kids that are really connected, have strong social networks. When you look at their online social networks, they look strong also. Those kids that are struggling offline are also struggling online, right? So the kids that are struggling with depression and loneliness, they're having problems in their own online lives. So the phone isn't exactly the cause. It might be a mirror, allowing us to see things and see a reflection of what's happening offline. And this quote really stuck with me from a focus group a few years ago, and it's this idea that we don't get it, right? The kids aren't addicted to their phone, they're addicted to who they connect with through their phone. So can technology for this generation enable connection, right, and avoid the disconnection that we're seeing? So with that, I will stop. I think we're gonna have the 3 speakers go before you yell at me about that message, so I'll stop.
Thanks. I think what we'll do is just have the 3 speakers. So Kay, yeah, absolutely. Kay Tai, neuroscientist, recent wonderful addition to the Salk Institute's faculty. And can I read this comment again of Alcino Silva's, because it was pretty important. Some of the recent works explored the role of neurons in an area of mouse brain called the dorsal raphe nucleus that apparently represents the feelings of social isolation. To our knowledge, Tai explained, this is the first time anyone's pinned down a loneliness-like state in the cellular substrate. And Alcino Silva commented there's something poetic and fascinating about the idea that modern neuroscience tools have allowed us to reach the very depths of the human soul, and that in the search we've discovered that even the most human of emotions, loneliness, is shared in some recognizable form with even one of our distant mammalian relatives, the mouse. Okay, time.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? So some stimuli evoke an innate emotional response where no training or learning is required to have emotional responses to them. And in my field, working in mice, dissecting neural circuits, there's been a lot of controversy about whether people experience emotions in the same or different ways than animals. And so this is sort of an impossible question to answer. And there's no way to really know whether an animal's emotional experience is the same or different as a human's. And so even though I'm really interested in emotion and subjective internal experiences, what I actually study are motivated behaviors. And I think it's really perfect that Candice gave us such a lovely introduction because the work I'm about to talk about today, which was led by Jillian Matthews here. Want to give a little wave, Jillian? Jillian Matthews, I'm about to talk about her work. Also got me a lot of hate mail for a very different reason. And so it was a completely serendipitous discovery that Jillian had, but essentially what she found, and there's a few different discoveries wrapped up in this one story, but the first was that after 24 hours of isolation in adult mouse, which is not very long, we saw this increase in glutamatergic synaptic strength coming onto these dorsal raphe nucleus dopamine neurons. And most of the time when people think about the dorsal raphe nucleus, you think about serotonin neurons, but there are also dopamine neurons that are nestled in there. Furthermore, after isolation, if you present an animal with another animal, there will be a heightened response of these neurons to that social agent after isolation, suggesting that these dorsal raphe nucleus dopamine neurons, or DRN dopamine neurons, track the experience of social isolation. We also found that if you activate these neurons using a technology called optogenetics, so we call this photoactivation, what we see is that animals will be more sociable, they'll have increased prosocial behavior, but that the photostimulation is actually aversive. And so this was very confusing, and we did the experiment several different times and got the same result. But basically, we were trying to wrap our head around this, and what we came to was a metaphor. If you think about eating food, you can eat food because it's delicious and this creme brulee is really enjoyable, even if you don't necessarily need it. Or you can eat to escape the unpleasant state of being hungry. And similarly, you can engage in social interaction to escape the unpleasant state of social isolation, or you can just engage in social contact for social reward. And so previously, people had studied the role of different type of dopamine neurons in social reward, and this was the first time that anyone had explored the role of any neurons in a loneliness-like state. And so one other thing I want to point out is that there's a phenomenon that's been widely seen in humans, in pigs, in rodents, in primates, where if you isolate individuals for 8 hours, 24 hours a week, some relatively short period of time, when you reintroduce them to the social group, you will see a rebound of social interaction. So, you've been away, you see at the airport, people get off the plane, they greet each other, there's a high level of social interaction. And this phenomenon in itself just suggests that there is a homeostatic set point, some preferred level of social contact that we all have. This varies from individual to individual, but this is another concept. So what we found is that, what Jillian found is that when you inhibit these DRN dopamine neurons regularly, when animals are group housed, it actually doesn't do anything. But she had the insight to actually see what happens when you isolate the animals. Inhibiting these neurons blocks the isolation-induced rebound of social interaction, suggesting that these neurons are critical for driving that increased interaction after isolation happens. And then if you look at the psychology literature, because loneliness is not a word that neuroscientists use, hence the hate mail. But in psychology, loneliness is a well-defined concept, and it has a series of markers, many of which we found. The trickiest one for us was that loneliness is subjective. It's not just being alone. You can be alone and not feel lonely. You can be in a large group, like in this auditorium, and feel lonely. And so how do we get at this subjective experience of loneliness in a mouse when we don't have a subjective readout? How do we know it's not just, a rich social, how do we know if it's social versus it being just a rich sensory, set of stimuli? And a mouse produces sounds and odors and visual stimuli. So maybe it's just much more stimulating than being in an empty cage or having some inanimate object. So the way we got at this question was to look at the social rank. Every group of animals, people, mice, and mice are not that different from people in this way. They'll typically form groups of 15 or 20, maybe 30. And if you think about human beings, class sizes, sports teams, departments, similar groups of animals, and we also form some sort of social structure, a hierarchy, something to stabilize the interactions, and mice do this as well. And so we can look in the cage and look at how different animals are ranked, and basically all of these findings that we showed here by manipulating dorsal raphe nucleus dopamine neurons were highly dependent on the social rank of the animals. Essentially, manipulating these neurons does a lot for dominant animals and not so much for subordinate animals. And so this is something that is still under exploration. So one idea that we were thinking about is that these neurons represent an effector system in this concept of social homeostasis. And so you might be asking, what is social homeostasis? What is homeostasis even? Homeostasis is simply any physiological process that helps maintain stability. So there's energy homeostasis. I feel hungry, I eat food. Thermoregulation. I feel hot, I'm going to sweat or move into the shade. And similarly with social homeostasis, individuals have set points. You can feel overcrowded and then want to get some space. You can feel lonely and then have an increased motivation to seek social contact. And so if you're interested in this is something that Jillian and I put out last year. and just a concept paper. So that, I'll just end right there and pass it off to Karen. So thank you.
Okay, next is Karen Dobkins. You know, the shift in this has been quite remarkable. I did a search the other day at the PubMed, National Library of Medicine, and I put in loneliness as a search item, and it went back to 1890, and there was one paper. And it stayed there until 1975, when it went up to 26. And then 2,202, 2019, 823 papers on loneliness. So people have been shifting and thinking about this in different ways. Karen I've known for a while when she was doing perceptual brain development in children. She's a professor of psychology at UC San Diego, but she has shifted to do some rather interesting things in mindfulness and loneliness. All right.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? So we all have heard, Candice said it, that loneliness and anxiety and depression is on the rise. Loneliness is not good for you. It's associated with health problems, early mortality, etc. So I'm sort of here to start out by saying, like, so what are we going to do about it? Maybe in the discussion period we'll talk about media, because I love your data that it's at an individual level. It's not the cell phone, but I think it's the culture of the cell phone. I think we have changed. The stage is getting bigger. The stage is getting bigger every year because of these platforms. And again, I'm not going to say they're terrible, but something's changed where people are doing a lot of impression management. People are getting further and further away from who they are. It's a big question, like, who are you? And sometimes I ask in my workshops, like, who are you? Are you the identity that you formed over the years? And we all do, and I did too. You know, I'm a professor, I've got 3 kids, you know. We define ourselves. We have to have an identity to navigate through this world. You know, unless you want to be a Buddhist monk and live outside that system, which is fine. But how do you kind of, you know, build an identity on Facebook or Instagram or whatever you're doing, or in your job to get your promotions, but still really deep down know that you're a lot more than that? And how do you learn that, and how do we teach that to our children? Sometimes when I give talks to audience, I'll start out and I'll say, okay, here's a question for you. Who invented public education? I mean, most of us are educators here, so who invented it? And usually the audience kind of looks at me like, well, what do you mean, who invented it? So obviously education has been around since the dawn of time. You know, fathers have taught their sons how to farm, and mothers taught their daughters how to sew and cook and stuff. And then there's been pockets of, you know, obviously Socrates had his disciples, and, you know, throughout history there have been these teachers who have their disciples around them. But the idea that all people should be educated is relatively new. And I'm going to give credit to somebody named Horace Mann, who was like a minister of education in the late 1700s. And he's the one who came around and said, like, children should start out in school and learn stuff, right? And that it should go all the way to 12th grade and then go on to college. And it's amazing that, you know, in this planet of 7.7 billion people, really we all agree that we should be educated. And it's also amazing that we all pretty much agree that not only should everybody get an education, but the curriculum, we agree on the curriculum. You know, history and math and science and language, English, whatever your language is. But I think what we're learning, and the more people I talk to about it, the more people I see go like this when I say this, is that where's the course on how to be a human? Where's that in schools? I mean, you always say, oh, well, you'll learn it naturally. Like, you'll learn how to have a clean communication with another person. You'll learn how to notice when you're lonely and go out and do something. It's natural, you'll learn it. But I think more and more people are starting to talk about a curriculum. In fact, even at UCSD, I'm on 8th College is opening up in a couple of years, and I'm on that committee that's deciding what the curriculum is going to be. And we're honestly talking about a curriculum where people take a class on how to have a good relationship with yourself and other people. So, loneliness, you know, 5 years ago, I started teaching a class at UCSD. It's a class on how to have a good relationship with yourself and other people. And I've been teaching it about twice a year ever since then. And I'd say a large component of it is how students can face their loneliness. And I don't want to say get over your loneliness, because I don't think you really get over loneliness. Loneliness is part of being human. I mean, it's lonely in here. What separates me from you is my skin and bones. Like, the best chance I have to share my experience with you is to use this archaic system of symbols called language. And it's very limiting. For you to really understand what I'm experiencing isn't easy. I have to be very clear inside myself first, what's happening, and then I have to use the right words to tell you what's happening, and then you have to hear my words and don't filter them too much and really get what I'm trying to say. So I didn't plan to say too much about the research, but I will say that we have been collecting data on the course for years, and we see improvements in loneliness and decreases in depression and increases in well-being. So I really do want to put a pitch in. I think I've already made my case that students need a course in how to navigate this thing called being a human. But I am going to shift gears because, as Roger mentioned, although I was trained as a neuroscientist and I studied brain development for many years and I still love the brain and neuroscience, I decided I wanted to completely change my research focus, and so about 5 years ago I did that. I threw out all my visual equipment that I've had for years, and I did something really scary and risky, which is I started a whole new research program with zero background in the area that I was moving into. Something we're highly discouraged to do as scientists. It's true. So my lab studies mindfulness and well-being and loneliness, and I'll just tell you a couple of little facts that we've collected over the last few years. First of all, because we study mindfulness, and mindfulness is a part of the workshop, we have data from over 8,000 UCSD students. And the relationship between mindfulness, if you put mindfulness on the x-axis, and loneliness on the y-axis, is an incredibly strong negative correlation. So we have all these surveys. By the way, I guess I should explain how this goes. There are surveys that go out online, and students fill them out. Maybe it takes 20 minutes. And so we've got a survey about their depression, maybe 20 questions about depression, 20 questions about how mindful they are, 20 questions about their loneliness. We use the UCLA loneliness scale. And lo and behold, when you analyze the data, and of course it's correlational, so you don't know what's really driving it, but it's a start, is again, the more mindful people are, the less lonely. So we were very encouraged by that, because the course that I teach is a lot about mindfulness, so we really think that that's one mechanism to attack your loneliness, because it's never going to completely go away, but you have to manage it. The other results, and I think, Kay, you might find this interesting, because the way you talk about about physical hunger and relating it as a metaphor, as an analogy to social hunger, is the way my lab thinks of it too. So we all have vital resources that we need to attain, to survive and thrive. And so food, and water, we just need that. And if we don't get it, we die. And we've got very strong, raise your hand if you've heard this word, interoceptive signals in our body, interoceptive. So exteroceptive means like vision and audition, the things exterior, the exterior senses. But we have an intricate network inside of our bodies to sense the internal physiological states to help us with homeostasis, as Kay so nicely defined. And hunger is part of an interoceptive sense. So I can tell if my stomach is full or empty, and those signals go to my brain, and if it's empty, my brain is told, you're hungry, you go out and you get some food. Well, in my lab, we think of social interaction as a similar vital need to physical food. And so we think about the mechanisms, interoceptive mechanisms in our body that let us know that we need this social connection. So I think the last result I'll tell you about in our lab that we're really excited about, and we're writing a full paper about, and I think this is what Roger originally saw published from my lab, is there's another test, a survey that people can take. It's called the MAIA. It means the multidimensional assessment of interoceptive awareness. So it's like 20 questions, and it's asking you, how aware are you of feeling hungry, and how aware are you of pain in your body. So there's a bunch of different scales. The two major ones I want to talk to you about is a scale of noticing. Like, how well do you notice that, like, you've got a little cramp in your side, or how much do you like fuss about it versus like kind of breathe through it? Like, how much do you notice? So like, just take a moment in yourself and ask yourself, do you tend to notice your body sensations? Okay? Another scale on the same measure is called body trust. Now that's not about noticing your signals, that's about how much you trust your body signals. So the questions are like, there's three statements. One is like, I trust my body signals. One is, I feel at home in my body. I can't remember the third one, but you get the idea. I feel at home in my body and I trust my signals. Again, that subscale is different than just the noticing, because you can notice it and not trust it. So again, just take a moment and ask yourself, do you trust your body? I mean, I know it's not the question that you get asked every day of your life. Like, it's an unusual question, but do you trust your body? Do you trust your body? Yeah? Okay, good. Because like young kids get it, and then we condition ourselves on top of that, and we forget how to trust our bodies. So we've got this result that we're very excited about, showing that the more you trust your body, the less lonely you are. It's a very, very strong correlation. We see it over and over in all different samples that we look at. The more you trust your body, the lonelier you are, the less lonely you are. And I'm going to stop here because I'll wait for I'm sure you're going to say to me, like, how does that work? What's the mechanism? And I'll tell you during the question and answer period. So thank you for your attention, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things, how many of you actually got a card when you came in, question card? Did you actually stop to get one? All right, so you've got them. Are there if there's any of you who would still like to have a question card, let us know and we'll try and get them to you. The other way of dealing with it is, okay, how are you doing?
So I'm about to project a slide, but we also have a website called Slido, where if you just go to that on your phone, there's an access code that you can put in, and as you can see here, and just put in your questions on that. And so that's an alternative to using the cards, or you can just raise your hand and we'll try and bring you the mic. Okay.
So what I'd like to do next is to have the three of you come up front and then start a conversation going. There's a lot of interest, obviously, on this campus. I see. There's the Sanford Centre for Compassion and Empathy. Bill Mobley's at the back there, who's directing it at the moment. Fadl Zaidan is around somewhere, who does science on this sort of stuff as well. Lot of papers coming up on mindfulness on these issues. And it's spreading. I mean, UCSD is doing a great job. And Doug Zadonis, I see at the back there as well, who's very concerned with these issues as well. David Brenner's office. I also heard a podcast the other day of the university chaplain at USC, Varun Soni. Who's the first Hindu chaplain at USC, and they were a very similar description of how he said that when he first started doing the job some years ago, the question that the students were asking him was, how shall I live? How shall I live? And he said in the last 5 or 6 years, so many more of them have been asking him, why should I live? So if you look at the numbers, I don't want to go through all this stuff now, you can look it up yourself. The suicide rates have gone up quite dramatically. And it's not clear to me how any of these questions are easily answered, how you build communitas, Victor Turner, the anthropologist, term for a spirit of community. I mean, it used to be that's what religions did. This generation, these Gen Z that Sony is looking at now, 50% of them have no religious affiliations whatsoever. So is there something else that can be done to deal with that? I mean, they have just built an $800 million, 2,200 bed building, which the architecture is supposed to infuse a sense of community. And he tells a story of a student coming up to him and saying, "Can we have a separate table in the dining area where we can just switch the cell phones off and just talk?" And so he said, "Well, what are you talking about? We just built this entire place for you to be communal in, and it's a great dining hall." And he said, "Well, have you been there lately?" He said, "No." He said, "Well, go and have a look." And in fact, everybody was on cell phones. And you had to get permission to kind of get off the cell phone. So the notion of going in there, and the student himself was proposing that there should be a table where student ambassadors engaged and stimulated conversation. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about. It's not just, it's fairly widespread and somewhat worrisome. So anyway, let's not go down that road too far. But it obviously is a plainly a fact that there's something going on. Question is it just the technology? Is it just now? Why is this going on? I mean, if you'd had a cell phone in 1665 or 1666 or whatever, I mean, you could have been saying, well, the Royal Society that was formed in 1660 is very good. But God, that plague last year, the Great Plague, and now that London's on fire. I mean, there have been periods in history, despite Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now, in which things, really bad stuff happen. Question is, what is happening now that makes people so lonely, depressed, anxious, and so on? So let's find out who would like to say something about this. Just raise your hand. Right.
If you could pass your questions down to the left so that we could easily pick them up and go through them. Thank you.
What does it mean to trust your body? How does that translate to loneliness?
Okay, that would happen. Kids that up here. Okay. So, if you want to have a true interaction with another human, because if it's not true, you're going to be lonely. Like Kay said, you can be in a crowd. I could be talking to you, Kay, and I could feel lonely as hell if we're not having a true connection. Right? Does that sound about right? But how am I going to have a true connection with you if I don't have a true connection to myself? If I don't actually read my own signals and know what's going on, I can't really connect to you. And I know that sounds woo, but I don't care. I don't care. I mean, 10 years ago, I might have been embarrassed as an academic to say that, but I don't. But I think more and more academics are speaking out and saying, no, there is something to this. So trusting my body is knowing that when I'm in a conversation with you and you said something I didn't really like and I'm getting a little bit like tense in my chest, that like I stop for a second and I go, something's happening here. Instead of barreling through the next sentence with you or taking it out on you, I really need to check in and I need to trust that my signals are telling me the truth. And listen, I'm not the first person to say this. William James, the king of psychology, he put this forth, over 100 years ago. He said that the body signals are the ultimate truth, so trust it. So there you go.
The British BBC did a survey recently called The Anatomy of Loneliness. You know that there's a minister for loneliness in the UK now, and it seems to be an even larger problem there than here, frankly. And of those 55,000 people, what was clearly important was them to find friends. It's the same thing. This is obvious. How do you not be lonely? You hang out with people. But what are the qualities that are required of that? And the things that came up over and over again were trust and authenticity, basically. In other words, being able to assess those sorts of things. So it's not. Does that fit in with what you were talking about?
Sure.
Here's one for Candice. Would you ever view your data from the lens that while students who are more connected feel better, less lonely on days when they're more virtually connected, might they feel more negative even lower lows on days when they're not connected, and this may precipitate loneliness, depression, and illness. Is it on?
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so I would say that one association we have is very small, so it could very well be pushed in the other direction, but the main finding from our work is finding really not a lot of link between kind of time on devices or what kids are doing in devices and feelings of loneliness or depression. So we see some signal with kind of positive affect, feeling happier when they're connected, but the main point for us wasn't so much about whether or not, after a certain point, whether or not the phones are the cause of something. It was trying to figure out this distance between our strong beliefs and attributions about what phones and technology were doing and the kind of absence of evidence, right? So why is it that we're ready to believe and blame devices, right? So why is that story so compelling? Maybe it's because it's true and we're just not there and kind of measuring it the right way. So that's one possibility. But there's a risk, so economists would call it an opportunity cost, to watching the phones and not focusing on some of the things that have been happening in the US, like the opioid epidemic, like that these children were born right at the Great Recession. They were in the midst of a Me Too movement and conflicting gender roles. So these big societal drivers that have been rolling along, our point was, let's just slow down a bit and start to take a broader picture of all the factors that are coming into play, instead of just focusing on the phone, which seemed to be the laser focus of media and parents.
Okay, can I ask you a question, Kay? We've talked about this before, and this applies to all of the neuroscience stuff that comes out. You show people a scan of a brain, and you can see what's happening and what neurons are doing what and talking to which and so on and so forth. How do you move from that to a subject like this? I mean, what are the practical applications rather than simply a description of the mechanics?
Well, I guess a cynic might just say that's all it is. You're just having a description of the mechanics. But when you think about, I'll just continue on this path of using the metaphor of hunger. If you understand the mechanism of how hunger is signaled, okay, we detect low blood glucose. Their signals are sent to your brain then processes, then you start looking at food and like paying attention to food cues and ignoring other. I mean, it's true that there's this phenomenon, and I think it's a reasonable point that someone can make to say, who cares about mechanism, except for people who are really curious about how things work and what it means to trust your body and what it means to have an experience. And so I guess I'll speak just for myself, but even from when I was a young child, I was always fascinated by these strong subjective experiences of emotion and what is this, why are they potentially, sorry, a little high on the audio here, but why are they potentially universal, if that's even true? How do we recognize emotion in other people's faces, and how do we have a real connection? If you can't recognize emotion in other people, then you couldn't have a real connection. And if something is, real, then there will be a mechanistic explanation. So I guess one way to tie it back that's probably further in the future would be, we already heard about how there's so many, negative physiological effects of being lonely. Immune system changes, life expectancy, there's many different risk factors, and loneliness is one of them for many different physical diseases as well as mental health disorders. And if we understood what produced loneliness, that would help us unravel how it links to physical diseases and mental diseases. So I guess it's kind of like, why science?
Terry, what was the question that you had sent in on the other day? Do you want to read it? Or?
So we've heard of the negative consequences of loneliness. Is there an upside? In other words, sometimes, there's compensation?
It's funny you should ask that because I was just thinking about introversion, and there's some books coming out now about how important it is to be an introvert as well. So I mean that's my quick response to that is like it takes a lot of energy to have true connections. I have a lot of true connections. At the end of my day, it's like leave me alone. You know, I need to regenerate, and that's what an introvert is. So I don't know that I'd call it loneliness. I'll let you guys speak to it, but I think needing space away from that, it's a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to make good connections. Yeah.
You might so I guess I'm of the belief, this is all speculation, but that all states that are so universally found are evolutionarily adaptive in some way. And I think the advantage towards survival of being within a social group for many species is enormous, right? Not only, safety in numbers. If you're a prey animal, it's easier to hunt in a pack. It's easier to stay warm if you huddle. There's, I think play, fighting, play engaging, this is how you learn to be a human. And if you're in a social group, you'll learn those things better. And I think really, particularly for humans, it is possibly the reason why we dominate the planet is because we work together and our ability to function in social groups. And so there's a huge advantage of being in a part of a social group. There's also disadvantages, and I think loneliness serves the good purpose of increasing our motivation to seek social contact, to reconnect, to make the sacrifices that are part of being in a social group. So that's what I would imagine would be the advantage.
Just to add to that, I mean, the same way you don't like the way it feels when you're hungry, right? It doesn't feel good, but that's the signal. Mother Nature made it feel not good, so you'd go out and eat. Same thing. Mother Nature made loneliness not feel so good, so you'd go out and reconnect. Yeah.
How many of you are actually in college, in university? Quite a few. So, does any of this resonate with you? I mean, do you get this whole thing about loneliness and what's going on? Do you have friends? Was it hard to make friends?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a comment. So I'm a bioengineer. From an engineering perspective, I took a class, ME3. So the professor shows us like a brain teaser, draws a line, puts letters up or below that line, and we have to figure out what's the pattern. No one could figure it out. Turns out all the letters with a straight line are on top, and all the ones that are round are on the bottom. Turns out, like, children just figure it out from the get-go. And part of an engineer is to think out of the box and unlearn basically language, like, oh, is it the vowels, like all this and that. So my comment and how I see this manifest itself in loneliness is, it was mentioned that by 2 or 3 of you, like loneliness increases and body trust decreases with age. Can there be a relation between, like, the more you learn, the more you experience, the less plasticity you have of the mind, the ability to think outside the box in terms of culture and routine, the increase in loneliness, and with that, like in terms of culture and routine, like for adults, there's like an increase of responsibilities, like, you're a parent, and less, and you always deny like self-responsibility. Anyways, that's how I kind of mixing engineering and what I've heard from you guys. And yeah, I do feel lonely, so.
Give him a hug. How many of you people actually hug people, by the way? I mean, I know, this is the trouble, Terry. I mean, you all know, many of you have seen me walking a lot and waving to people and so on, and I hug the security guards at Salk and so on. But there's certainly if it's females, I mean, you almost need to get a Me Too license approved before even entering. So we've had some problems with that sort of stuff. Oh, let me just mention while this is a member of Kay Ty's lab. This is Mackenzie Lemieux. And Mackenzie is putting on a wikithon on March the 7th, which is supposed to increase the number of women on Wikipedia, and she's been doing that. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, so I guess based on the Me Too note there. Hi, I'm Mackenzie Lemieux. I wanted to let you guys know that I'm hosting an event for International Women's Day, and it's a Wikipedia edit-a-thon. Essentially, we're all going to come together at Geisel and learn how to create and edit Wikipedia pages, precisely to increase the representation of women on Wikipedia, because currently only 18% of English Wikipedia biographies are about women. So we're trying to change that.
Thank you. Can you talk about loneliness and high suicide rate at UCSD students in the context of sacrifices made to pursue higher education, and perhaps the other metrics of a, quote, successful generation?
Yes, I think that's one of the kind of leading contenders to explain some of the uptick in levels of stress and levels of disappointment that young people have in themselves, is the pressure that's put on very early, especially in the United States context for college admissions. And so increasingly people are starting to kind of look at this as one of the kind of main sources of pressure for young people.
Let me just add 3 more questions together, and then you can all think about this. Do you think there's more loneliness now, or it's just more talked about? In other words, you get more press out there. You know, the number of papers that I cited going up rapidly, is that because NIH suddenly said, oh, we should fund that one? And suddenly there's a lot more papers being made, but has anything changed? I'm not being critical, I'm just asking. Secondly, how much of a person's feeling of loneliness, sensitivity to it, is nature versus nurture, upbringing? And do you think it's because people focus on themselves more now? Those all join together.
So I'll do the thing about is it inheritable. So pretty much whenever you do a twin study, you know, the classic twin study, you ask whether the loneliness level, if the loneliness level is more similar between monozygotic twins than dizygotic twins, you've got proof that there's a genetic component. So it turns out pretty much no matter what question you ask, the answer is yes, that there's always a genetic component. So there is a genetic component to loneliness, but it's obviously not all genetic, it's nurture too. Because if it was perfectly genetic, you'd get a complete correspondence between monozygotic twins and you don't. I don't know if you guys know about those data. Yeah. So I answered one question, you guys do the others.
So I think, just bringing up, going on the National Women's Day, and I read something, and I'm going to bring this up because it stopped me in my tracks, and it was something that I hadn't thought of. And it's the labor of building connection. And so in another world, in a twin study, we go in and we map children's neighborhoods, and we try and understand kind of how cohesive a neighborhood is. So how well people know their neighbors, whether they'll borrow something from their neighbors, whether they know them by names, whether they'll intervene and help out their kids, right? And you find kind of fascinating things when you do that in terms of some of the highest poverty neighborhoods have the highest levels of cohesion, and it relates to things around the built environment and community and culture. But I was reading a newspaper article was written by a sociologist, and they started to talk about women's entry into the workforce and all of the labor that went into women organizing these community get-togethers, right? Whether it's rural communities, whether it's suburbs, whether it's dinners, and all of that work that goes into bringing people together, to bringing communities and families together. And as women enter the workforce, on Sunday night, I'm getting ready for work. I'm not cooking dinner for my entire neighborhood. And I hadn't thought of that in that way. And I've been studying social cohesion for a long time. And it's it's not the upside of lonely, it's a social trade-off, right, of women in the workforce, and it's a great thing, but nobody is taking up that labor of creation of community in the way that women did in this.
All right, connecting this to community building, any recommendations? How?
Have you host something like this, where people start talking? Because I got to tell you, I've been a professor at UCSD for 24 years, and I'm in the trenches with the undergrads, and they're starting to talk. They're talking, and they're saying that they are very anxious and they're depressed. I mean, I'll do like an anonymous survey in my big undergraduate class of 300 people, and I'll be like, how many of you have at some point experienced like almost what you think is clinical levels of anxiety or clinical levels of depression. And the number of people who say yes to one of those two or both is really high.
Yeah.
And they're willing to talk about it.
It's huge.
There's not shame around it as much as there used to be. Really, I mean, no undergraduate would have admitted to me that they have clinical depression or anxiety even like 15 years ago, but now they do. Right, you guys? Aren't you willing to admit it? You did. You started out. So, yeah.
I think we have to also account for the fact that, and I sound like the pro-tech person, and I'm really not pro or anti, but follow young people where they're going to find out information about what they're suffering with, what they're struggling with, finding out where they're going to connect, and in many cases they're going digitally, right? They're trying to connect. This generation is finding places to connect online.
Mm-hmm.
They're connecting with each other in these ways, and we can look at that and say it's not the way we connected, it's not the way we have, but there are ways that people are forming communities, connections, people that have been left out of kind of traditional groups, and kind of understanding and seeing that is going to be an important part of a whole range of solutions, both offline and online.
Yeah, so do you think this is early days still, and that students themselves, young people themselves, will actually figure out with their dynamism some way in which these things can be used to create communities that they're comfortable with, rather than isolate themselves?
I think they're doing it. It's hidden in some ways, and so communities are going underground. But there are other places like 1,000,000 cups of tea or 7 cups of tea, 1,000,000 cups of coffee, where people are going online to find social support and triaging these ways. So these things are forming. I'm not suggesting they should replace person-to-person connection or having that person you go to for social support, but we're going to need a whole host of solutions, digitally enabled and community enabled and peer enabled, and to really combat what we're seeing, which is probably a mix of a real increase and a reported increase.
If I could chime in on that, I mean, obviously, I don't know the answer. There hasn't been a well-controlled study that I would, back, but I think if I was to speculate, I think there's a combination. Humans evolved in tribes and groups, lots of communal living, raising children together, living in small quarters, even being nomadic and traveling together, and things are very different now. And I think the evolution of society has far outpaced the evolution of the human brain. So certainly that's one component. I think there's also some societal and cultural changes that have happened in recent decades about comfort with discussing these issues. But I think I would be really surprised if the loneliness problem was really that different 20, 30, 40 years ago as it is now. I think it probably was really different, millennia ago when everyone's living in a really small cave together, or, being a nomadic tribe and sort of, being more eusocial. These days it's different, right? I mean, you have neighbors, but would you really just leave your kids with your neighbors? Because not really. You get a babysitter. It's just a different culture. And I think, as you mentioned, how often are you having a huge gathering at your home? It's just less. And I think that is just real less communal groups of contact. But I think more recently, it's probably a result of stigma. But I mean, if you look at the DSM-5, now it's a DSM-5, but if you look at the DSM, the diagnostic manual for psychiatric disease states that has evolved a lot, and each version is different from the next. So I think there's a lot of differences in thresholding as well.
Yeah, somebody over here was. Yeah, you should. And then
I think you can teach people how to connect. I think there are practices, there are methods. I threatened Roger that I was going to ask this audience to do what I do in my workshop, which is an eye contact exercise. I'm not going to necessarily go through with that, but we'll do. Oh, or do you want to? But raise your hand if you've ever done an eye contact exercise. Good. We're with a stranger, which is even better than somebody you're intimate with. You look at them, and it's not a staring contest. It's not about don't blink. It's about actually taking a moment to realize that the person across from me has a consciousness, and they're a being, and I'm a being. And it really comes down to it. I can tell you all about how many papers I published last year and the research in my lab, but who cares? Because in this moment, I just want to take you in. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. You know, when I was growing up in New York, sometimes they were the Hare Krishnas, and they would like come up to you in Central Park, and they'd be like, they'd gaze in your eyes, and they'd be like, hey man, I love you. And I thought they were like, oh my God, they're so weird. Now I look back and I go, no, they were right on. They looked me in the eyes, and they told me that they love me. You know, so anyway, I think you can practice connection.
Right, gaze and touch, gaze and touch. You had a question? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't get the memo on the question card. So, funny that you brought up introversion, and I was fascinated by the circuitry that Keitai showed with rebound reward after social isolation, and I was just thinking about those individuals that are not socialized properly and are antisocial, and then get social anxiety, which could lead to then loneliness. So I was just wondering, if you extrapolate to the human, do you think perhaps that circuit is rewired in those individuals, or maybe they're getting dopamine from being more introverted, or again, do you think that might depend on where they see themselves in the social hierarchy?
So actually, there's this whole other project in my lab that I didn't have time to talk about. Sorry, is this working? If you stress animals, even a non-social stressor, at early stages of their life, it can change dopamine from being a pro-social signal to being an antisocial signal. And lots of things evoke dopamine, you know, changes in stimuli, unexpected rewards, stressors also actually produce dopamine, but your brain will reinterpret that same stress signal. Like, this is also true for different, like CRF, a stress hormone, as well as dopamine. And this is something that you can become sensitized to and then actually flip the valence by which you recognize the signal. So absolutely that's true. I don't think that's the same thing as introversion. I would describe introversion and extroversion as being something along the spectrum of where your social homeostatic set point happens to lie. But I do think we have evidence to think that this is true, at least in mice. I don't know if it's true in humans, although Nadine Burke-Harris would argue that the number of traumatic events that you have, early adverse childhood experiences that you have, will predict a number of different things, including mental health disorders. So I think there are a lot of pieces of correlative evidence in humans that would suggest it would also be true.
Yeah, this is probably you as well. One of the great researchers in this field, a man called John Cacioppo, who died a couple of years ago, sadly, and his widow's still around. They're still doing some work, but he wrote some amazing papers and had an interesting evolutionary strategy about where loneliness might have come from, and his wife has continued that work. The reason I'm telling you this is that one of these cards here says, "Is there a pill to make me less lonely?" And what Stephanie's been doing is working on that strategy that she and John worked out, and they're looking at the levels of pregnenolone and allopregnenolone. Is this anything that you have any thoughts about, that literally you could change the levels of loneliness by?
I don't have anything to say about that particular pill.
Okay.
I am a big fan of the Cacioppo's work, but I'm not. I don't have anything to say about that.
You run into any Candice? Any?
Yeah, I'm also not going to talk.
Okay.
Well, I'll talk about pills. No, I mean, I am going to.
There must be a story in here
Yes.
somewhere.
Well, no, I'm going to do a shout out for something else that's sort of taboo to talk about, which is psychedelic drugs. Because, I mean, who here has read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan? No, it's a really good book. And I think one of the things that people who are in the contemplative sciences would say is that part of the reason that we're so miserable is because we filter every experience through our noisy mind. We don't get to just experience things because we're always labeling and talking over it. And a lot of the work on psychedelics shows that the reason that they help with all sorts of things, depression, addiction, is because they shut down the default mode network, the part of the brain that's constantly talking about ourselves and blah, 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 blah.
Mind wandering.
Mind wandering. And it's that mind wandering that filters everything that we would ordinarily experience that's perfect and beautiful. And that's why kids are happy. Right, kids? Because they don't have that yet. So one of the things my lab studies is mind wandering. And we actually have this device that it's called experience sampling method. We use it's put on people's cell phones, and it goes off a few times a day. And they have to answer, like, are you being present or are you mind wandering? And if you're mind wandering, what are you mind wandering about? So people mind wander a lot. And we find that when you're mind wandering, you're not nearly as happy as when you're being present, as when you're present. So I think the pill, I mean, I don't want to go off and off. You're going to think, like, what's wrong with this woman that she wants to talk to and selling drugs to us? I'm not. I'm just saying there really is some very thorough and careful data on the topic.
Yeah, but it's confusing, isn't it? Because you'd also think that you said it's not as effective. You'd also think that would be a time when you could be, as it were, ruminating. It's all. Fadl, do you have any thoughts on that from mindfulness perspective?
He doesn't know anything about mindfulness.
Where is he?
I'm only kidding. He's like the world expert.
The question is, how does mindfulness impact default mode?
Yeah, DMN.
Sure. So the idea is that when you can become less judgmental about arising thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and reappraise in a contextual fashion, that we become less engaged in self. And as a function of time, we become a little bit more empathetic and compassionate, where self becomes kind of all of us in a way, where there's that less of a perceived divide between self-perception or self-referential processes and processing everyone around us. And mental training, mindfulness-based mental training, can really help with that. And we've seen some in our own work that when we're practicing mindfulness, that default mode, which is basically a neuroprotective evolutionary byproduct of oscillating activation between the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, that deactivates and it becomes more stabilized as a function of practice, A, and B, people who become more dispositionally mindful actually have lower baseline activity in DMN, a default mode network. So it's a kind of a hot topic right now in human neuroscience, and we do see that other natural products like MDMA, is that natural? No, I mean other products.
Psilocybin.
Like
Psilocybin's
MDMA
very
and
natural.
psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, if you will, can assuage or attenuate mind wandering and default mode activation in a way that's directly related to health improvements.
Well said.
A couple other ways to get in that same state is obviously through meditation and getting yourself in a state of flow. And to like simplify that very complex and detailed description, talking about getting in a state of connecting with everybody and everything and understanding that we're all part, or finding an understanding that we're all part of the same thing, we're all connected, and connecting to that, like you feel that connection that it's always there, but when you're thinking and your mind's active, you're completely out of that mode. You can't really feel it. And so that's what she's talking about on psilocybin and stuff, which often, as you said, can get you also into a circle in your conscious brain, which can be very detrimental, but some people have really good experiences with it. So anyway, here you go.
So, self and no self. Buddhism. All sorts of things. Anyway, here's a question from Siddharth. Siddharth, where are you? Way at the back. Okay. Could you please comment on the possible correlation between economic income, quality of life, etc., and loneliness for kids in different communities? For example, kids in low-income families may tend to have more social contact due to their lifestyle, participation in closely knit religious services, lesser access to digital platforms, denser neighborhoods, etc.
Yeah, so just two quick observations on that. In our latest British data, one of the most remarkable things on loneliness is we find no differences across socioeconomic status or gender. And so that was kind of remarkable because in every kind of psychopathology, we see these kind of early origins and deficit. We've talked a lot about kind of the, in our own work around the digital divide and how that's manifesting itself around very different experiences of children from lower and higher income homes. And it turns out that the digital divide in terms of access to devices is closed. So lower income kids and families are more likely to have devices. They spend 3 more hours per day on their devices than kids in higher income families, and they receive on average less support in navigating those online worlds. So they're less likely to be engaged in educational and having the kind of personalized tailoring of digital experiences, and less likely to have supportive adults who scaffold their digital experiences. So similar to what we're seeing in terms of the offline world and the growing opportunity gap between those in the upper 20% and those in the lower 20%, we're seeing that amplified in digital spaces, right? And so that's one of the kind of real concerns that I have online. Yeah.
Thoughts on cell phones decreasing attention span. We now have an attention span of 8 seconds, which is same as a goldfish. Decreasing attention span and this affecting loneliness. Now, this is a cool point. Is it the decrease in attention span that means that your capacity to engage in a conversation that is rewarding and bonding has been damaged, hampered? Whomever.
Yeah, so I think the question of the inattention, whether it's caused by the devices, is a good one. Among adolescents, what we see is kids get bored and then they go to the devices. So when we do the experience sampling, we find that the inattention and ADHD symptoms come first, and then it goes to the device. But there's obviously a bi-directional thing that happens there. In terms of whether the inattention in terms of attending to cues inhibits the ability to form connections, that's probably better.
We have another audience question.
We
Yeah. Were you in the middle of answering a question? Did this just die? I think it just died. Hello?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. So we're having a really rich conversation in verbal language about loneliness. Now, you said that language is really limited and archaic and doesn't, but is there a way to translate between verbal language and our interoceptive signals? Because it seems to me that if we don't deal with verbal language in the issue of loneliness, then we can't get to what our bodies are communicating. If we're learning to understand signals and trust them, we're dealing with verbal language and thinking, which is a kind of
Just to be clear, I'm not down on talking.
No, I'm just wondering scientifically if it's possible to translate between.
I think that's what we're trying to do every time we're in a conversation with somebody. Oh, sorry.
The microphones
Are we able to translate between the interoceptive signaling that's coming from our bodies and verbal language so that we're able to, because we're talking a lot about language here, and it seems very rich and rewarding.
Yeah, and it's the best. I don't know why the microphone's not working, but it's the best we have. Language is the best we have. So this isn't working either. So language is the best thing that we've got. And all I'm asking is for people to get used to telling the truth. This is one of the major parts of my workshop. Is like, we all think that we're doing. I mean, let me give you a concrete example. My sister was on the dating scene, and we're going to talk about my sister on the dating scene. And she went on a date, and the guy really liked her, and she didn't really like the guy. So the guy's like texting her saying, "Hey, when can I see you next?" And she just doesn't respond. She's like, "Oh, I don't want to respond. I guess I'm just going to tell him I'm busy." I said, "How about you tell him the truth? oh, that would hurt his feelings. No, if you don't tell him the truth, it's going to confuse him, and you're just going to add confusion into the planet. So just take a second to tell him the truth and say, thank you for the date last night. I didn't really feel a connection, but thank you anyway, and good luck. I hope good luck with the next date. There's so much love in telling the truth versus all this manipulating and trying to phrase things in a way. So I think that if we all got used to telling the truth, and part of telling the truth is sometimes in your body, and that's what I'm just going to reiterate what I said before. There's ways in which I will sometimes be in my office having a conversation with one of my students, or anybody, could be you, and I'm just getting uncomfortable. Maybe I'm feeling a little insecure, or I didn't like what they said, and I can just feel like one shoulder go up, like that little tiny bit, or my mouth like kind of, and I can feel, it's embodied cognition. I feel in my body that I'm uncomfortable. And if I'm not paying attention, before I know it, I'm going to say like exactly the wrong thing to this person, as opposed to like owning the fact that I'm having some weird reaction in my body and taking a moment. Sometimes I'll even point it out. I'll say to my student, I'll be like, what, did you see the little shoulder thing that I just did? I'm getting uncomfortable. And then we'll laugh, and I'll tell them, like, I'm uncomfortable. I wanted this done last week, and I'm feeling frustrated that you didn't get it to me. It's my frustration, it's not yours. But that's the way we can talk to each other, and nobody learns how to do it. Now's here we all break out into a big applause for me. Oh, okay. I was only kidding, but okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. There we go.
Here's one for you, Kay.
Can I ask a question earlier? I had the microphone, but then it died.
Oh, that's not fair. Yeah, you go.
Well, hang on, let me just give it to you so you're not feeling isolated and lonely.
Okay, is this on? Oh, wow. Is there an ideal group size for connection? And I imagine that it would vary based on the duration of the connection.
Something to say about that, which is in places where you're trying to get people to connect, usually smaller group sizes are better. And that's actually one of the things that my lab is investigating, is whether group size matters. So get back to me. Ask me again in a year.
Yeah. Pete, can I ask you a question? This is Pete. Yes? No? Yes, this is from the Legla Bembo Foundation, who actually funded a lot of these things, but also funded a huge number of things in this town, and they're all basically driving community involvement, I would say. You've watched all these things happening. You've watched what's going on in Balboa Park. You've got projects going on in there. These various projects, do you sense them producing positive results from? I mean, how do you think it's working in terms of the communities in this town?
Well, I think we're making progress in some areas. We have a lot of tribal thinking with everybody only looking at their own situation. And it's interesting because part of what we're dealing with here is communication, and that is basically lacking frequently. People unable to listen to the other person, whether in a disadvantaged neighborhood, talking to people on a very different type of person, or whether you're talking to an intellectual who knows everything. They're not listening to each other. And that's the main thing, I think, that holds us back. A lot of good things happening, but I think it's the ability to talk to each other, listen to each other, respect each other, that I think is what I see as a major detriment to what's going on.
So how does an organization like yours, which has been in this town for so long, try and combat what you just described as tribalism? There's a new book out on tribalism as well. It's obviously a de rigueur phrase at this point, and it's certainly the way people are feeling about things, borders and walls and stuff.
Well, I guess just an individual or an organization, all you can do is try to exemplify what you want other people to do. It's really important, I think, particularly for people of power and authority and wealth, to deal with the power dynamic in a way that tells other people it's not about me, I'm really interested in you. We're working with a program to talk about training in this area, trying to get other people in the foundation space, particularly where frequently it's very much just about them, paying no attention and asking everyone to prove themselves every year to get a nickel. That hardly sends a message that you care about anybody, and we need to change that. So those are the kinds of things we're doing.
Thank you. Where are you?
Hey, Roger.
Yes, hi.
So I have a question for the panel. Last year, my wife and I decided to just take personal responsibility for this experience of loneliness that we were going through in our lives, and we decided to host a weekly connection dinner in our homes. And so for almost a year now, we've been hosting a weekly connection dinner. It's usually about 10 to 12 guests, and it's a different group every week. It's a diverse group, and we facilitate connection and conversation in a very specific process through the evening. And the results have been extraordinary, not only for us, but for those in attendance. I would also encourage, we've also decided to take that offline, and we created a private Facebook group to continue that connection, and now are hosting 2 larger annual events to bring everyone together in one night. I would highly encourage, especially those younger folks in the room, to utilize social networks that they're already a part of online to take those relationships offline. We formulated that gathering to be potluck formatted, so everyone would have investment in the process, and so it would be also easy and sustainable for us to reproduce on a weekly basis. But I just highly encourage everyone to just take simple steps on a regular basis, even if it's just a small group of 3, 4, 5 people, and just take personal responsibility in creating that in your lives. The results can be extraordinary. So that's something I want to share. My question to you is, do you have any personal, practical implementations and solutions that you implement in your daily lives that could facilitate connection that you would like to share with us?
Well, let's talk about dinner parties. What's the first thing when you meet somebody? Okay, let's try it. No, here we go. I'm good. I'm back. So when you meet somebody at a dinner party for the first time, what's one of the first questions you ever ask them? Hi, nice to meet you. What do you do? What do you do? And it's like we somehow think it's the most important question, like, what do you do? What's your job? But what if you said to somebody at a dinner party, nice to meet you. What makes your heart sing? Again, I sound woo-woo, and I don't care. Because nobody really wants to talk about what they do. I mean, you think you do, but you don't. What we want to do is we want to connect. So, I mean, that's an implementation. That's something, obviously, not going to surprise you to learn that that's what I actually do at dinner parties. Eventually, I'll find out how you make your money, but I don't really care how you make your money. That's not how I'm going to connect with you. So there you go. That's my tidbit.
So I spend time in the dog park with a very large puppy. And so I kind of make that joke, but I was against getting a dog because what does a person who works full time with 2 little kids not need is a dog, right? A puppy. And the reason I said we should get a puppy, maybe you should get a puppy, you can have a puppy, is because we had moved to a new neighborhood. We had moved to a new neighborhood where we didn't know our neighbors, right? We lived 2 feet from each other, but we didn't know our neighbors. And within 2 weeks, we knew our neighbors. And so, it's a lot of extra work in kind of our daily life, but we now know kind of all the dogs and the kids in the neighborhood. So, puppies.
Another one. Are you okay?
Hi. My question is, do you study cultural differences? Because my friend and I, we come from Mexico City. That's where we were raised. And Mexico is much more social than here in the U.S. or Britain. And I moved to the U.S. when I was 19, and I, noticed right away how different the culture is. So my question is, do you study loneliness as a factor of cultural differences?
Yes, so I think it's the exact dynamics you're describing are a protective factor for kids for mental health, right? And we see this in a couple of ways. We see it with immigration patterns. So second generation immigrants tend to have worse health. So the U.S. is a risk factor. I mean, there's alternative explanations for that also, but than the previous one. But for children especially, having the kind of strong social and familial bonds, which often come in terms of enclaves, kind of recently immigrated cultural enclaves, protects especially from kind of early forms of adversity that we'd see in things like the ACEs. So yes, it's a short answer.
There's a couple of questions here.
So this is for is Don. This is for Kay. It was really interesting, your interpretation of the raphe dopamine neurons that were feeling a negative effect, loneliness, and it was fighting loneliness. What about, but you made the analogy to eating, and that sometimes we eat for pleasure, for true pleasure. And how is that analogous to seeking human contact for pure pleasure? And do you see a neurobiology of that? They both seem really qualitatively different, more, sensual and for the way of food, but I guess also in terms of contact. And empathy is a hard thing to imagine as arising from the firing of some dopamine neurons. So that's my question. How do you take it to this other level, neurobiologically?
Scientist. I think that's a really good point. I guess I would argue that social contact can also be very sensual, very somatosensory. There are a lot of common brain regions if you look kind of globally, like let's say fMRI, bold signal. This is not necessarily at the single neuron resolution, but at the brain region resolution, you do see a lot of common reward circuitry that lights up with food, receiving water when you're thirsty, with social contact. So there is some common circuitry. Empathy is something entirely different. So, there's this detection of social isolation, and then there's I guess we had looked at this, and a number of other groups have looked at this, that in regions of the brain like the anterior cingulate cortex, these regions are important for empathy, altruism, observational learning, just being able to extract the experience of another through observation, and then creating a model for that, and then taking that information and then feeding it into your own associative learning circuits. So you're correct, it is a different circuit that is important for the motivation to seek social contact and empathy or altruism or observational learning. But yeah, we know that. Yes. Well, I mean, I guess theoretically everything in the brain is connected through multiple synapses. But it's true that the prefrontal cortical regions feed directly into the dorsal raphe nucleus. And actually for a long time, thinking back to even like Stephen Meyer, I think models for depression and learned helplessness come from looking at prefrontal cortical neurons that project onto the dorsal raphe nucleus. So, learned helplessness is sort of when stressors are presented many times, and then an individual will present depression-like symptoms. That's individual, but I think it's possible, perhaps likely, that a similar mechanism happens when animals are excluded, or individuals are excluded, or subordinates, or ostracized, or somehow at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So I think then you accept your new reality, and that could be very similar to learned helplessness. We don't know yet. That is our hypothesis.
We had one. We're just a couple more. And I think you had.
Thank you. I was a bit inspired by what the gentleman back there with the dinner parties said, and it also connects to a question that you asked us at the beginning of this discussion about you were actually directing it to people who were in college right now, so I didn't answer. But when I was heading off to college, it was interesting that the term loneliness came to mind on a plane on the way to college. And I realized, wow, I've never left my hometown of San Diego. I'm going to be lonely. How will I fight that? And the answer came finding people that are into the same things that I'm into. And for me, that was poetry. It was awesome. I joined 2 groups, and it was beautiful. They became great friends from then till now. But I wanted to share also that similar to his dinner parties, a group called meetup.com brought a lot of people together, and for some of us, that's how we found out about this event. And so I was kind of answering your question earlier about how some of us have dealt with loneliness in college, and given a tip of the hat to someone else who inspired.
This is the last one here, and this is just to think about, it's not a closing thing. I find it hard to connect with my classmates because I judge them as not being in touch with themselves. What are some ways to overcome the distance? So that's probably just something we should all noodle on. What are some ways to overcome the distance? You can certainly do that. Say again.
Well, so the question was, you said, I'm a student and I sometimes I don't like other people because I feel like they're not connected to themselves, or judging them because they're not in touch with themselves. And I said the way to love somebody who's not in touch with themselves is to realize that you're not in touch with yourself sometimes. Whoever wrote that, just know you're not in touch with yourself sometimes. So have some compassion. You're just like that other person.
Who wrote it? Brave enough to show you. All right, well, we could go on for a long time, but I think still some food outside. And let us thank